In the last segment, I talked somewhat at length about the operation of Congress within the context of the Senate. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the House of Representatives and do that more briefly. But first, let me just repeat a few of the general points from earlier. First, keep in mind that large and complicated pieces of legislation often take years and years to complete. This is one of the reasons why reauthorization of certain bills, such as No Child Left Behind, get postponed. It's just that the sheer amount of work that's required on the part of multiple committees in Congress really makes it prohibitive in terms of getting the work done in a discrete period of time. The second thing to remember is that ultimately an identical bill has to be passed by both chambers of Congress before it can go to the president. Sometimes the Senate and House versions of similar bills just can't really be reconciled. There are pieces of them that are just too irreconcilable, and in that case, Congress has to keep working on the matter, often deferring pieces of legislation from year to year. Now, in terms of the House itself, you'll remember that that body is based on proportional representation of the voters, of the electorate. And as a result, that body is now over four times as large as the Senate. There are 435 members right now. The most populous states, of course, command the most number of House seats. So in this case, if you add up the seats of just 9 states, those members will collectively represent a majority of the votes in the House. You remember the contrast here is with the Senate, where the senators from a number of the smallest states can actually command a majority of votes in the House. So in lots of ways, the House is actually the polar opposite of the Senate. And what I mean by that is that the incentives in the Senate are usually toward some sort of compromise and collegiality. And the House, the incentives are really toward finding some kind of coalition of representatives that can create a majority of votes on a particular issue. Now here's a recent listing of House committees. You'll notice if you linger over this list that a lot of those are similar to the ones in the Senate, but not all of them are identical. There are some organizational, some committee structure differences between the House and the Senate. These aren't dramatic, but from time to time, depending on the legislation, they can be important. So just keep that in mind, that the House and the Senate are organized in terms of their committee work a little bit differently. And of course, there are subcommittees in the House just as there are in the Senate, and of course, the ones in the House are more numerous because it's a much larger body. But keep in mind that the subcommittees are valuable from the standpoint, especially of junior congressmen and women, because they provide opportunities for very junior people to exert some leadership, even if that's only at a very modest level. Now here's a listing of the House leadership positions. Given the more numerous members of the House, it really shouldn't be too much of a surprise that there are more leadership positions available. Now, once a politician gains one of these positions, then obviously that person's profile is raised considerably within the body and within the larger national political scene. And it's often the case that it makes it much more difficult to knock out a person who's in one of these leadership positions. There's a nice example from Kentucky. There's a congressman from southeast Kentucky named Hal Rogers who's been in the House, I think, for about 35 years. And he is on the Appropriations Committee, which is a very, very pivotal committee in terms of divvying up House money. And he's managed to send lots of federal dollars back to his very poor Appalachian district in Kentucky. And there's really very little incentive to vote Hal Rogers out of office because he is in that very senior position on a very influential committee, ready and poised to help his district back home. If the people in that district voted him out of office, he would be replaced by somebody very junior who would almost certainly not be put back on the Appropriations Committee. So that's how this works. Now, one of the chief differences between the House and the Senate is that the rules for the way bills travel through the House are much stricter than they are in the other chamber. Typically, the debate on a bill in the House is much more limited, and usually amendments can only be offered if they are what we call germane or particularly pertinent to the subject of a bill itself. And of course, there's no real analog to the filibuster in the House of Representatives. So as a result of these things, as I said a little earlier, the incentives are not for bipartisanship and compromise, but really for an individual political party or a cluster of interests, maybe even across party lines, to rally to pass legislation that will only have a bare majority. And let me just finish with a point that I've made repeatedly, which is that staff are very, very critical in the way all of this plays out.